We thank Jeff for running last week after I was sick and Karl was out hanging in the cold weather out at Refuge last week. So we missed out on a really good chapter because last week was all the questions that Jesus answered. So unlike all the other ones that we've been going through, it's been just question upon question upon question that Jesus asked. And so last week was a good chapter, I think. But it starts a transition in the book, actually. So up until this point, you have all these questions about, so Jesus asking the question of, and I'm going to forget all the questions. I had them in my mind. Like, who are you looking for? What are you looking for? What is your name? Do you see this woman? All of these questions that drive to a point. And then last week with the questions that Jesus actually answered, it gave a picture of who Jesus was and his teaching and what he actually handed over information about versus just asking a question. Because we know a lot of the times Jesus took questions and then he asked with a reciprocal question, which then really doesn't get to it gets you to a different point, but not necessarily to a teaching point. Where today and the next few weeks, so we have so today is chapter 10, we have 11 and 12 that are left, and then we have the final class will be lots and lots of questions. We're not really sure how we're going to do it. We may just read all through the billions of questions. So how many is it? 307 questions. And then you guys we're going to have a pop test at the end. You have to remember at least 306 of them. But today, our question is looking a little bit different. So we switch actually the way it's written. And so the next 2 weeks will be, one is from the cross, questions from the cross, and then the last one, questions from a risen Christ. Where this week we get to questions about who Jesus is. And this is an identity question, but it's a different identity question because it's about Jesus himself. And so the passage this morning, we're grabbing the Mark passage because it's shorter. The Matthew, and I think Luke also has it. And they're a little bit different, and they go different directions to a point. They add extra things in, like the crowd and different kinds of things. But Mark 8, 27 through 30 says this. Jesus and his disciples went on to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. On the way, he asked them, "Who do people say I am?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others one of the prophets." "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Peter answers, "You are the Messiah." Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. And so the Matthew passage actually ends up giving the biggest blessing that Jesus gives to one individual in it. He says, Peter, you are, Peter, well, he uses Simon, son of Jonah. Sorry, Simon, son of, I should have written it down or had it down here. But, and he goes on to bless Peter, and that upon him, the church will be built. So this is one of those big passages about Peter in Matthew, where in Mark, we sort of skip that. Think about it, this being Peter's gospel. He's sort of not wanting that to be broadcast, I guess, as much. And he just goes straight to the picture that Peter says that he's the Messiah. Then he goes on and he's like, don't tell anyone about this. And so this picture that we have here of what's going on, they're hidden from everybody. They're outside of the group of people. It's just probably the 12 and Jesus, maybe one or two others that are just hanging out there. And he's just trying to figure out what they think about him and whatever other people are thinking. Because, I mean, he hears it too. So, I mean, but he wants to know what they're thinking. And the pictures definitely are one of those things that lead to what's going on here. So you see the first question that we're going to throw up here today, is, who do people say I am? So it's an interesting question, simple question. Who can answer this question? Anybody? Who do people say Jesus is? Anybody? Can anybody answer that question? Everybody should raise their hand now. This is a very easy question. Who do people say Jesus is? And this is all he asked. How do we talk about Karl? It's an external question. It's sort of an objective question that you don't really have to.
That it seems it's very broad. I mean, if somebody's asking a question, do you guys know Jeff? Oh yeah, well, what do you know of Jeff? And you can just hear answers and general answers, and it seems pretty open about it. And it's interesting is that first question, I can envision Jesus saying, hey, who does the crowd say I am? I wrote it down. The Son of Man was another book phrased it, and then who do people say I am? You can just see that it was probably just a conversation, and you're hearing John the Baptist, Elijah, prophet, other prophets, and you could probably see some chuckling, and probably some like, really? Some of those kind of answers. It seems a little funny.
Yeah, it's one of the things in the book, Martin, he goes off and he's like, yeah, so every theologian has an answer for who do people say Jesus is. And they talk on this higher level. You talk as an objective person. You can do the same thing for Socrates. You can do the same thing for Abraham Lincoln. You could do the same thing for George Washington. Who was he? Who do people say he is? He chopped down a cherry tree when he was a little thing and went and told his dad, hey, I did it. Of course, that's not true, but that's another question. It's just one of those things that we've made up about him. And that's the same thing about Jesus here. So he goes through the three of them, or the three that are listed there. Depending on which version you see, you may see different names. But you have Elijah. So Elijah was normally the one that was thought to be that forerunner of the Messiah. And if you remember what Jesus says about John, is that John was Elijah at one point whenever he's talking about John. Because John was really the forerunner, not Jesus. Then the other one was one of the prophets. Yeah. And so one has Jeremiah listed in there. I think it may be Luke or Matthew, one of the two, has other prophets listed. Because it's that whole picture of you think somebody's coming and somebody's going to take their place or come in and lead in this Messiah. So as you hear about John the Baptist in the book of John, this road worker, this person that's getting the road ready for the Messiah to come. Because, that's what happens when somebody important comes. Somebody comes and cleans the street. You may not have your street ever cleaned beforehand, but if the president's coming to St. Louis, I would almost guarantee all the streets in St. Louis are going to get cleaned the week before, just so that it'll look clean and he'll be happy to come and say, hey, St. Louis is a great city. I love St. Louis. And so this is what's going on with Jesus, and they think that Jesus could be that person as well, because they're taking John out of the picture. And so then Peter gets the different question, or they throw a different question out to him. So the other question, so as we switch from this general question to the other question, this is the big one. So who do you say I am?
One word change. It goes from people to you. Completely changes the question. When I was thinking about this, it was when somebody's asking a general question, or if you're happening to be, in class or at a place, and somebody, offers a question up, and it's not necessarily directed to you, but you probably mutter, oh, I know this, it's this answer. And it's pretty easy, you feel like, yeah, I know that's right. But then when it gets turned to you, and you are asked that question, you're maybe a little hesitant to answer it quickly. You start second guessing what if that answer is right. And you can see it, you start to really think about that answer before you actually would respond to it. Except for what we see is Peter seems like, ooh, I know. Yeah. First one, blurts it out and says it.
Yeah, and I always wonder, Karl, how much time is there? So we've been doing Acts on Wednesday nights here at the building, and I'm always about Luke, that Luke has these gaps. He doesn't tell you there's gaps, but there's sometimes like a year in that time frame, and it's like 2 lines. And like this, it's like, did Peter just quickly jump on it and just say it right then as part of this whole picture of them throwing out all these answers? Jesus switches the question. He's like, hey, you're the Messiah. He's like, something like this, or is he's like, he waits to the very end and nobody's really answering, and finally he shouts it out. So I really wonder if there's an actual pause there between the two things happening.
Yeah, you can almost see, again, if you look at the first question, it's just kind of like a general question. They're giving their answers and things else along that line. Conversation's probably flowing, it's probably, and then all of a sudden he asks this question and it just kind of stops. You can just see them just kind of probably looking around. Martin talks about it as they're like probably all looking around like, who wants to say it first? They're all questioning themselves whether they actually want to say it or if they actually do know it.
Yeah, and it's one of those things that, like, the Messiah picture is a very, very difficult picture to bring out. So here it has the word Messiah, and Mark it has the word Messiah. We also know it as the Christ, the Son of God, as being the answer that he gives in Matthew. And that picture of the Messiah, just by saying that, you are putting not only him in danger of life and death, you are also. Because if you're proclaiming that this is the Messiah, you're now saying that the other people who don't trust him as the Messiah, or if he is not the Messiah, you've now blasphemed. So it's a pretty big thing to say this. Kate?
I just wonder how far along in his ministry before he asked this question. Because I would think at the very beginning, they might not be able to answer that until they was with him for a long period of time. Because they already heard, that, well, this is the carpenter's son, people dismissed it and everything, but his disciples were with him all the time, and I don't know if this was the beginning, the middle, or the end. Do you know? I mean, is it clear?
Usually they think it's later, but so if you think of 3 years, later could be 1 year in, it could be 3 years in, but I think it's probably towards that 1 year-ish mark. The problem is that in none of the Gospels do they reference it to a time. So you can't identify, this happened right after the Sermon on the Mount. This happened right after this. We just know that they all disappear from being with everybody, with the crowd, but there's nothing clearly defining this exact position. But it's usually assumed about at least the year end. So most of them have known him. All 12 are there, at least, is what the assumption is. But more than that, I don't think that we have any more details.
I think back to the word I am, going to Moses. And, God says, I am who I am, which is his name, Yahweh. So the Messiah, for somebody, well, when Jesus came out of the desert and he went to his hometown and read that scroll from Elijah, and then he says, in your presence, I am God, and they wanted to throw him over the cliff, and he walked through them. So you're absolutely right that to make the claim of being Messiah would be blasphemy, and that's why they nailed him to the cross. So I know in Catholic doctrine they're saying when Peter answered the question that somehow Peter was being anointed as special, but I truly believe that's a misreading of that passage, and it applies to all who believe that Jesus is the Son of God and that we're a priesthood of all believers as a result.
Yeah, I think I would agree with you. It's the wording of the faith that he's putting into Jesus, that proclamation of that declaration, sort of like last week with Delaney, to a point, as she declared who he is. And that's where it gets to the question, and that's where it gets very difficult. Because one of the things is that even though let's say there's 12 people there, only one of them answer, all of them are having to make that same proclamation by following him and doing his will. Because that's where Jesus leaves us. He doesn't leave us with really that whole thing of, you can just be just a normal follower or just somebody that just does whatever. That's not really an option. You could do it, but that's not what he's calling everybody to. He's calling everybody to proclaim this message and this question's answer to everybody around them. Karl, any other thoughts?
I was just in Matthew 16 here is when Peter said that, it says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered, "And blessed are you, Simon Barjon, right? For the flesh of the blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven." So his faith and the Holy Spirit told him.
Yeah, so it's one of those things that Jesus' proclamation there is a bit different because he pushes it up to God, has given it through Peter. And so this is where it sort of gets interesting, how the Spirit is talking through Peter. But we see Peter on the day of Pentecost proclaiming, hey, this is a gift that you can all have. So very powerful that it's all related back to this whole confession of faith. So the first question that we have relates, I think, right to this. How do you answer Jesus' question, who do you say I am? This feels like we're sitting around a fire, and Peter is standing over there, getting ready to yell out, "You're the Messiah!" Because I think it's one of those things. I think we put that question in there. It's actually the next question, your question that you threw up there.
Yeah.
Brian, you want to throw that up there?
But yeah, so in the book, Martin talks about he was at a gathering, and a question was brought up because these are all preachers that they're all talking about, and the question was, when was the last time you told your congregation how much Jesus means to you? And it led into a kind of not a debate, but a kind of a conversation about it. And then it leads into this, kind of like a question of, when was the last time you heard anybody tell you how much Jesus means to you, other than maybe a preacher up on Sunday? Have any of you, I know I haven't, told anybody, believer or non-believer, how much Jesus means to you? And is it easier to say it to a believer, or to a stranger?
Yeah, it gets into this whole picture of evangelism. It gets into the picture of the observer versus the participant. So the previous question, what do people say, or who do people say I am? That's that observer situation, and we're happy to answer that all day long. It's whenever we're put into the participant, it changes. And then it changes who we want to participate with and answer the question with. Whether it be a stranger, whether it be a believers, whether it be just amongst your family. And so it's really a struggle, I think, that we have as believers to be that outgoing like Peter was, I think, and be willing to, whether or not it's sacrifice or not, to sacrifice for what we believe. We usually think about Americans and how great they are, that they're willing to sacrifice and they paid the price to fight for freedom and all this and that. But are we willing to pay the price to sacrifice for our freedoms by proclaiming Jesus?
First question.
You want to go back one?
Yeah, just that one.
This one before
one
this
back.
slide before. That one.
So yeah, how do you answer that question? So one little twist on that is like we answer it by how we spend our time. Do we spend our time praying? Do we spend our time reading God's Word? Do we spend our time thinking about the people at the coffee shop? Do they know Christ? Do they have Him in their life? We answer it by how we live our lives. Do we really believe that Jesus is the Christ? It's something we need to ask ourselves every day. You know, who do people say Jesus is? And then, who do I say Jesus is?
I also think that you're really opening up yourself to talking. If I talk to these two guys on Wednesday mornings, am I willing to open and bear my thoughts and feelings about it? And do I actually know who Jesus is? I mean, I can read and we can talk, but is that actually what I think?
Yeah, one of the other questions, it doesn't like my phone. So one of the other questions, it's the one that starts with Martin, and it says this: Martin suggests that there is no right answer to the question, who do you say I am? But all the true answers have some real consequence to our lives. What are the consequences or repercussions for your life of your answers to this Jesus question? And so it's one of those things that as you think about questions and answers, just like how Peter, by him saying that could have been counted as blasphemy against him. And in the end, really, he does die for this answer. Same way that Paul dies for the answer, the same way that Matthew dies for the answer, the same way that most of the apostles that are sitting around that circle at night die for this answer. And so we think about consequences, and as we were chatting about it last Wednesday, Karl's like, I don't like that answer, or I don't like that word, because the fact is that it's not always something bad. So it uses the word, I threw the word repercussion in there as well. It was mine, but when my phone was with me, but no, it stopped. So we switched, I added that word repercussion in there, because repercussion, even consequence could be positive. There's positive consequences to things happening, but generally we think of it on that negative side. Another word that Martin uses is the word implication, the things that it implies to your life. And that's where it gets very interesting in our lives, because it could change what you're going to do moving forward. You could be directed this direction, where once you make that confession, you start going this direction, because it leads you to different things. You may stop searching for money and moving to searching for God more.
Or is it a question or no?
Yes, there's a question. Yeah, so the question, what are the consequences for your life for answering Jesus' question?
So, I think for all of us, we could think that if people don't accept or don't go, don't accept Jesus right away when we talk to them about, we could think that it's kind of a repercussion. Let's say they will be, I won't get the job, or they won't be my friend at work, or, like that. But I think, like a seed, looking long term, I think it always will have a good consequence, because at one point something will make them realize, oh, I heard it a year ago, so short term it could be bad for us or for anyone around us, because it could bring in trouble, not just even us, but maybe our family. So it could, but then long term, I think God will always use it for good.
I think, again, if you use consequence, it seems to be a negative thing, because you think, if you say something, you're going to get, we would think of a reward instead. By doing something as you're supposed to be doing, seems to fit, but then again, it doesn't fit, because you're not rewarded, but it does. At first, when we were talking about it, I didn't like it, but then as I started thinking about it more, I'm like, okay, I can see it. I can see by your thoughts or your actions and such that what you're doing, there is consequences if you're not following Christ.
I've been reading about the 20th century author Shirley Jackson, and when she was in college, she wrote a piece for her college newspaper that they published, and one of the fellow students of hers at the college, Stanley Hyman, who became her husband, read this piece that she wrote, and after he read it, he said, "I'm going to find the woman who wrote this, and I'm going to marry her," having never met her before. And I always kind of wonder if he led with that when they actually met in person, you're my future wife. But all of the answers for who do people say that I am seem to be, for one, kind of peculiar, because they're people who have died in the past. And they're all sort of seen as these forerunners for the Messiah, but they're not taking that further step that Peter makes, where he basically says, "You're the one." And so it almost strikes me like that romantic scene in a movie where, it's that heart-fluttering confession of love. It means a commitment, like you said, not necessarily consequences in a negative way, but it's like, this is serious.
The other thing I'll throw out here before I hand it to Brad, but so I think about Paul's statement, to live as Christ and to die as gain, and that really shows that consequence picture of both of them are possible.
I was going to say the same thing in terms of when you talk about Jesus, it's going to have consequences one way or the other. Sometimes they can actually be good. I can remember sitting in a group of lawyers one time, and one of the participants brought up his faith, and as he did that, and these were people who were Jewish and Christian and others, but everybody around said, "Oh, I'm a believer too. I have faith," and it's like it struck us that one person confesses that they believe Jesus Christ is the Messiah, and it can be explosive. But it can also be explosive. And I remember there was a young girl at WashU when I was going to law school there, was Jewish. She was converted, baptized, went home, told her family that she believed Jesus was the Messiah. and they held a funeral for her, and she never was accepted by her family again. Those are the kinds of consequences that scare people, you know. So Paul says, in our Christian lives, we have a certain odor. And, you know, it's a smell. It's a, you know, people can sense it. And I remember one client one time said, "You're one of those religious people, aren't you?" It just, you know, if you're living your life, there's going to be evidence. And I forgot who wrote this, but somebody said, you know, if you were on trial for being a Christian, would there be enough evidence to convict you? You know, most of us would struggle with that. But yes, it's scary sometimes to confess your faith publicly because you don't know what direction it's going in.
A real life example in my life was a counselor at CFS named Lindsay. That she's been a counselor at CFS for 4 years, but she was feeling a call to ministry, and she resigned her position in October to move to Joplin to take ministry studies. And I'm just struck by her conviction that Christ is calling her to this, and that her trust that where God is calling her, that He will provide. And the first provision that I'm seeing is that she's been offered a counseling position there to start in January. A lot of us know Karl went, and it's Karl's counseling agency that is hiring her. So it seems like her trust and the provision is falling into place, and and I'm struck by it. You know, I'm struck by her trust and her conviction.
The belief that Jesus is the Christ. He is the Savior. Knowing that, and I conform my life to His the best I can. I fall short. Others will see that, and others will be, inspired or encouraged. And then we need to keep on encouraging others. Whether it's a consequence or it's a reaction or whatever, it just happens. It's real simple. When we give ourselves completely to God, then what you're saying of it'll show up in what we do for entertainment, or how do we spend our money, whatever, it's going to be evidence, and it will have, as Brother back here, the flavor will be sensed by others.
So the next slide is one of the answers that he gives to this in the book, and he says, "We may hesitate not because we doubt the words are true, but because, having spoken the truth, we no longer ignore its implications in our lives." So this is why there's probably this quietness there, because they know that if they say that out loud, there's action that is required. So faith is not something that is just belief in something like the demons believe. It's that fact that action is required upon making that statement. And so as we close today, there's a parent meeting for teenagers and Honduras meeting right after class. So we're having to keep an eye on the clock and make sure we finish on time today. But so this is one of those things, as we throw up that last slide, Brian, that who do you say I am? This is what we leave you with. This is what we say, hey, think about it, answer it, proclaim it. Take the action needed.
I was just going to say one other thing about this question. It was in John Deere's book. It says some say that this question is the question of the whole gospel.
Yes. So let this gospel question go with you today. Thanks, everybody. Have a great week, and we'll see you next week.